Hey YouTube, in this video we're going to be taking a look at the MSI B650 motherboard. So, continuing on from my previous videos that I covered Gigabyte and ASRock, so now we're moving on to MSI. So, MSI is the one that when it comes to the budget-friendly B650 chipset, MSI is the one that I actually know the least about. I paid attention to MSI extensively when it comes to the X670 and X670E motherboards, because I do think that MSI does offer some of the, let's say, the best amount of features at the price point in the X670 line. But when we look at the B650 line, what we'll find is that there are some interesting choices from this manufacturer. In terms of how they've allocated some of the lanes, particularly with the PCI 3.0 lanes. So let's get into it. So just like with my other videos, I did a kind of a entry level, kind of a middle of the road, and then a more flagship or premium option on the B650 line. So interestingly enough about MSI, one of the things I do want to point about MSI, what makes them different, at least at time of filming, compared to the other three, is MSI is currently the only motherboard manufacturer out of the big four that does not offer a B650E option. So that means that none of their more budget-friendly chipset motherboards will feature the full PCI 5.0 24 lanes. And in addition to that, when we look at some of their B650 motherboards, some of them don't even have PCI Gen 5 at all. Meaning the NVMe drive is only going to be up to Gen 4 for all of them. So we're going to start off here with the MSI Pro, so the B650-P Wi-Fi. This one, it's around $200. If you go to the product page, specifications for it are pretty straightforward. I do like MSI's, the way that they do the specification sheet. I think they're the best one in terms of how easy it is to read stuff on their website compared to the others. So I really like how they show you the back panel ports and they have them labeled right here on the specification page, so you don't have to actually go into the menu to see any of that. They also have a handy little datasheet PDF file that you can download for a quick referral guide there. But if we look at the block diagram for this first motherboard, because that's what I like to look at. So this one, just kind of breaking it down, you get the PCI 4.0 X16, pretty much guaranteed for like any motherboard, doesn't matter what the chipset is. But then here's where it's kind of interesting. So instead of giving you a Gen 5 bus, they have opted to just do all 24 lanes at Gen 4 speed. So you get two NVMe drives, both X4, that wire directly to the CPU. But whereas with some of the motherboards we looked at from Gigabyte and ASRock, they all offered one of those NVMe drives at Gen 5 speed, MSI has opted to just go straight with Gen 4. So there is no Gen 5 at all on the Pro B650 motherboard. So that's really something worth pointing out, because I do think that if you compare the price point of this motherboard, right around $200, and if you look at a similarly priced motherboard from, say, ASRock or Gigabyte, and maybe even Asus, although we haven't looked at Asus boards yet, you don't actually have the option to do Gen 5 on this MSI motherboard. So that is very disappointing. I'm not sure why, because 4 lanes of Gen 5 really isn't that hard to implement compared to the full 24 lanes, which is what would signify a B650E motherboard. So that is something worth noting. So there is no Gen 5 at all off of those CPU lanes, so that is pretty disappointing. If we go down to the chipset, so they've done some really interesting things here. So they do give you a 4-lane PCI Gen 4 expansion card, which is very nice, because I do think that in 2023, you do want, even on these more entry-level type motherboards, you do want to see something like a by 4 lane, regardless of whether it's PCI 4 or 3. In this case, it's 4, which is good. The 4 lanes are very, very useful, because especially if we're talking about people who are interested in content creation, if you want to capture video from a console, for example, like a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X, those require a 4K, well, they don't require, but ideally you want a 4K 60 hertz capable capture card. So something like an AverMedia Live Gamer 4K. This is something that I have mentioned on multiple videos before. So I do think that if you are in the market for a motherboard and you do think that that will be something that will factor in, it is worth noting that this motherboard does have that. Where it takes those lanes, though, is from what could have been another NVMe drive. So this motherboard only features 2 NVMe slots, and they're both wired to the CPU. So nothing off of the chipset for NVMe storage. Moving on, you do get 2 more X1 PCI expansion slots that are wired as X1, so it's 1 lane each. And they're running it at PCI 3.0. So this is actually part of the 4.0 bus, but they're only running it at 3.0, again, as a cost-saving measure, just like with what we saw on the CPU lanes. Although the CPU lanes not running that Gen 5 is kind of weird, because I know AMD did make it an option to run Gen 5 storage, but this is the only vendor so far that I have seen that exercised the option to not use Gen 5. So here we're seeing them use Gen 3 on what would have been Gen 4 lanes. So they can certainly do that. That does keep the cost down. But you can see, so this is 4 lanes, this is 2 lanes. Then you have, remember I said you have a total of 8 Gen 4 lanes. So right now we're at 6, so we have 2 more. So we have to look at where the last 2 will be. And it's clear to me that one right here for the LAN, and then the last one will be the Wi-Fi. So you get 4 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1. That equals 8. So all of this is the 4.0 bus off of the chipset, because that's 8 total lanes of Gen 4 bandwidth. So that leaves the 3.0 lanes, and there's 4 of those off of the B650 chipset. And those can either run as Gen 3 or they can be dedicated to SATA. And obviously there's a lot of SATA drives on here, so MSI is giving you 6 of them. So what they have done is they've taken 2 of those lanes and they have dedicated them each to a SATA. So this is 2 of those lanes, I believe. And then you get 1 more off of an ASMedia 1064. Actually, I think what they're doing is there's 2 lanes. So there's 1 lane going to these 2, and then the last lane is going to these 2. So that's 2 plus 1 plus 1, which means there are 2 ASMedia 1064 chips, 1 per lane, and that's what gives you the total of 4 lanes of Gen 3. So they have used all the resources. I do like how they've allocated the resources on the chipset. So let's move on to the next motherboard here. So I've chosen to look at the Tomahawk, but there is also the B650 Edge Wi-Fi. But what I have noticed is that these two have literally the exact same block diagram. So the only difference between them is probably going to come down to aesthetics. And also maybe the heat sinks for the NVMe drives might be a little bit different. I think that the Edge includes a full aluminum heatsink for both of the lower 2 NVMe drives, and the Tomahawk does not. It only includes one for one of them, so that is something that is different. But if we look at the block diagrams, they're identical, and the price point is also very similar. So the Edge Wi-Fi, you know, like $259, the Tomahawk $259. So I do think the Edge Wi-Fi is supposed to be a little bit more expensive, but it looks like Newegg does have like a sale here, so it does show up. But if we look at the block diagram for the Edge Wi-Fi, you can see if I bring up the Tomahawk one right next to it or overlay it on top of it, you'll see that they're pretty much identical. So from a functional standpoint, these two motherboards are identical. Where they're different is going to be things like the heat sink and maybe the VRM cooling. So let's take a look at the Tomahawk one. I think the Tomahawk branding is a lot more popular with a lot of people who have owned MSI motherboards in the past, so we'll use this one for reference. But you can see here, just getting into it, you know, again, a lack of Gen 5 on the primary storage. That is only Gen 4, so that is, again, disappointing. So, again, there is no Gen 5 on this motherboard at all. And some people might not care, but with a B650 motherboard, you would expect that standard should be one Gen 5 drive to the CPU. So them not doing that, they're kind of trying to cut costs, but because of where these motherboards are priced, it's not like they're price competitive with the other vendors. So it's kind of becomes a harder sell at that point. At that point, then really what MSI is competing on is BIOS quality, how quick the BIOS updates come out, memory compatibility, and that sort of thing. And that's going to be more of like an enthusiast thing. So at this price tier, most of the people that end up buying these motherboards are probably not going to mess too much with that. So then it becomes an even lesser selling point. So I don't know. It puts MSI's B650 line in a weird spot. At least when you analyze it in depth like what we're doing here. So, but anyway, moving on. So this is basically the same as the previous motherboard, so nothing's different there. And then the chipset, it is different. So what they have done is instead of a 4-lane expansion slot, this is only 2 lanes. So this is not really that useful because you can't plug in a 4K 60 hertz capture card. Although, unless there's a newer one that's in the works from the likes of Elgato or AverMedia, it is possible to run a 4K 60 capture card off of 2 lanes, but you would need a higher spec generation. I think you would need PCI Gen 3 by 2 to do that. So if something comes out in the near future, then this sort of configuration will make a lot more sense, because I am starting to notice more and more motherboards are starting to include these strange by 2 electrically wired PCI Express expansion slots. So it's a by 2 lane, so not really that useful today, but it is there. And then you do have a third M.2 drive, so that does factor in. So that's using 4 of the Gen 4 lanes. This is using 2 of the Gen 4 lanes, so that leaves only 2 remaining. The last 2 are always going to be 1 for the LAN and then 1 for the Wi-Fi. So if you add them up, 4 plus 2, that's 6, plus 1, that's 7, and plus 1, that's 8. So all 8 Gen 4 lanes are accounted for on this motherboard, so that's really good. They didn't leave anything hanging, literally. And then if we look at the 3.0 lanes, here's where it's interesting. So I really like how they've done the 3.0 lanes here, although it is kind of interesting. So they have taken 2 of the lanes and they have split them. So they've done kind of like a hub configuration without using an ASMedia chipset, which is really weird. So for these 4 SATA drives right here, instead of running each SATA port to a wired lane or a Gen 3, what would have been a Gen 3 lane, they've taken that Gen 3 lane and they've kind of wired it to 2 drives or two SATA ports. So you have 1 and 2 are using 1 lane, 3 and 4 are using 1 lane. So that's 2 out of the 4 available. So that leaves only 2 remaining Gen 3 lanes. So the third lane is wired to this ASMedia 1061 for a splitter. So you can get 2 more drives off of 1 lane. So that one will not be able to support RAID. But I will say that because of how they're doing this, the bandwidth on these SATA drives up here, so the 1 through 4, these top 4, are probably not going to be able to achieve full bandwidth, theoretical max bandwidth, for like a flash-based SATA drive. So an SSD that is a SATA form factor, so a 2.5-inch SSD drive, it's probably not going to be able to achieve full bandwidth, although I'm not 100% sure if that'll actually matter. You can use RAID. You can do RAID on these SATA ports, these 1 through 4, but the total bandwidth is not going to be as good across the 2 of the drives that are sharing a lane. So that is something to keep in mind. So that's that. That's worth noting there. So that's 3 out of the 4, and then the final lane is down here. So they give you X1 PCI 3 expansion slot. So this is kind of good for some sort of legacy peripherals, some kind of add-in card, a media plug-in card. So something for like compact flash or memory stick Pro Duo. If you're someone who needs the media, if you want to plug in like a card reader that would go there. So that's kind of what that's for. Or maybe like a legacy capture card that can do 1080p 60, like an AverMedia Live Gamer 2. So again, just like with the first motherboard, everything is taken into account for. So everything's accounted for on this motherboard. So that's really good. So that leaves us with the very last one. So now we're going to look at kind of the more premium option for the B650 line. So this one's going to be the MPG B650 Carbon Wi-Fi. So this one, it is priced over $300, so that makes it kind of a flagship. So let's get into it. So one of the things about it is that it doesn't have the, if we go to the gallery page, one thing that you'll notice is that it doesn't have the debug LED, and I do really think that the premium option for all of these B650 motherboards should have, they should include the debug LED, because it's kind of, why not? Like, you're charging, you know, over $300 for a motherboard and it doesn't have that. To me, that's kind of a no-go, just from first impressions alone, just by looking at that. Now, some people might not care, and, you know, that's fine, but, you know, if you're someone who wants to understand why your motherboard is posting slow or why the memory is taking forever, like, it's kind of good to figure out what code or what stage in the initialization process is holding that up. But anyway, on a motherboard like this, overall, it looks good. Let's go ahead and look at the specifications. So this one does, thankfully, include Gen 5. Let's bring up the block diagram here. So this is kind of the flagship. You can see right off the bat, we get the Gen 5 NVMe right here. So you finally get that off of 4 of the CPU lanes. And then the remaining bandwidth is all going to be off of the 4.0 bus to the CPU. So that gives you 16 lanes for the graphics card. And those 16 lanes can either all go to the GPU, or they can optionally drive 2 additional NVMe drives at Gen 4 speed. So as soon as you plug in a M.2 drive into M.2_2 or M.2_3, that's going to make the graphics card's slot run at X8. So that is worth mentioning, but it is nice to have a lot more NVMe drives available, and an X8 GPU isn't really that bad, but just know that you are going to lose some of the peak performance off the graphics card if you populate either of those 2 drives. So that's cool that all of the NVMe's are now showing up on a $300+ motherboard, so that's nice to see. Moving on to the chipset, you do get a 4th NVMe drive, so there's one off the chipset plus the Gen 5 one here, and then you have 2 off of this, so you do have 4 NVMe drives on a B650 motherboard, so that is good. There is some lane sharing though with the GPU to pull that off, but that is kind of the compromise with going with a more budget line chipset. If you wanted to avoid the lane sharing, you'd have to step up to an X670 chipset to get more lanes for those drives. So they do have an X1 PCI 4.0 lane here. So this is 1 lane, this is 4 lanes. Remember, the total is 8 for the 4.0. So we're at 5, so we have 3 left. This is always going to be 1 for the LAN and 1 for the Wi-Fi. So now we're at 7, so there's 1 left. So the last one is probably going to be running the ASMedia down here, because they're probably running, these guys are using 4 lanes for the Gen 3. Each get their own lane, so, you know, we're at 1 lane on the Gen 4 is free, so they wire that up to the ASMedia. So that's probably how they went and did that. So very interesting approach. Overall, this is probably the best one. The other thing that's really cool about this motherboard, it has 4 lanes of Gen 4 open for an expansion card slot. So that's really nice, and that's off of the CPU. So that's actually really nice. The only thing lacking about MSI on the AMD side is MSI is the only vendor that doesn't offer Thunderbolt support on AMD. So what could have been an opportunity to plug in a Thunderbolt card here, unless it works without the control plane signaling cable, like a 5-pin header on Gigabyte, for instance, or ASRock, then I'm not sure if it'll work properly. Maybe it could enable USB 4 off of that expansion card add-in slot, but I don't know. So it's interesting that they did that, because I do think that it was smart to leave that open, because I think the other alternative would have been, give me one of these M.2 drives down here so I could drive 3 drives without affecting the graphics card, instead of 2 drives without affecting the graphics card. But they opted for that to give more expandability. So that is a nice approach. I think it's always kind of hard to pick and choose when you're a manufacturer. The only thing about the motherboard is that it really needs a postcode. I don't know why, because if you look at the Gigabyte Aorus Master and the Asus Strix, at this price point, this is a little bit cheaper than those, but it's like $20 cheaper just to not include the debug. Like, I don't know. MSI could have had a winner on their hands with this one. But overall, this one is still pretty good in terms of how they have chosen to use the resources. So I wouldn't mind recommending this one. Hope you guys like this video. And let me know in the comments what you think about MSI's AM5 motherboards on the B650 line. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.